Ask most people to name where the royal family lives, and they'll picture the postcard version: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, maybe Kensington Palace if they read the tabloids. They'll list a handful of grand addresses and assume that's it. 5 or 6 official residences for a family that represents the nation. It sounds reasonable, even restrained. But it isn't the truth. It's a curated illusion that hides the scale of a property empire unlike anything else in the modern world. The reality is that the Windsor family controls more than 30 properties across Britain: castles, mansions, hunting estates, rural compounds, cottages that are bigger than most hotels, all stretching across hundreds of thousands of acres. The combined value runs into the billions, yet the public sees only the handful that appear in news footage. The rest exist in the shadows, protected by secrecy, tradition, and the kind of PR that makes questions seem almost unpatriotic. This isn't conspiracy, it's documentation hidden behind language. When something is called private, it falls out of public accounting. When money comes from the Duchy of Lancaster or the Duchy of Cornwall, it's described as private income, even though those duchies exist only because of the royal position itself. The trick is simple. Blur the boundaries so thoroughly that even the experts can't tell where public funding ends and private privilege begins. If you enjoyed these kind of videos, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more untold history, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from Buckingham Palace gets the headlines because it's ceremonial, the setting for receptions, balcony waves, state visits. It's treated as the national palace, the property of the people, which in a legal sense it is. Yet for most of the year, it functions as a private home, closed off behind layers of security, with renovations funded by the public under the banner of preservation. The official narrative is that the monarchy costs each Briton less than the price of a cup of coffee. But that figure doesn't include the hidden costs: security budgets, maintenance at private estates, staff who work outside the sovereign grant. Add it all up, and that cup of coffee turns into an entire cafe. What makes this structure so effective is the way it feels untouchable. The royal family is wrapped in ceremony, so old that questioning it feels like breaking something sacred. They speak of duty and service, and those words act like armor. The nation is told these homes aren't symbols of wealth, but of history, that they're maintained for future generations. It's a comforting story that merges family and state until they become indistinguishable. Yet beneath the velvet and marble lies an accounting trick as old as the crown itself. In theory, the monarchy gave up its vast hereditary revenues to the government centuries ago. In exchange, Parliament provides an annual payment, the sovereign grant, now pegged at £86 million a year. That's the official cost of the monarchy, the line you see in reports, neat and finite. But it's a fraction of the truth. The real power lies in what's left outside those reports, the duchies and the private estates that keep generating untaxed wealth, quietly compounding across generations. The Duchy of Lancaster, for instance, provides the monarch with roughly £24 million annually. The Duchy of Cornwall gives the Prince of Wales a similar amount. Both are technically private, but both were created and sustained by public authority. They pay no corporation tax, no capital gains tax, and when they change hands, from monarch to heir, they bypass inheritance tax entirely. That one exemption alone has allowed royal wealth to grow uninterrupted for centuries, while every ordinary estate in Britain loses 40% to the treasury when it changes hands. The secrecy is deliberate. When journalists request the details of royal finances, they're told the monarchy is exempt from freedom of information laws. When Parliament asks for explanations, ministers defer to constitutional convention. When campaigners argue for transparency, they're told that revealing such data could endanger national security. It's an elegant defense system, vague enough to be unassailable, old enough to be accepted. The less people know, the easier it is to preserve the illusion that the monarchy somehow pays for itself. And illusions matter. They keep the story intact, the one where the royals are simply caretakers of history, living in old houses too drafty to envy, sacrificing privacy for duty. It's a narrative so successful that many Britons genuinely believe the monarchy costs nothing. The palace's PR team works tirelessly to maintain that impression. They release annual transparency reports, complete with glossy photos and simplified charts. They highlight charity work, tourism revenue, and economic impact. What those reports never show is how much the family's personal comfort depends on public systems, the police protecting private grounds, the army handling ceremonial duties, the tax breaks enshrined in law. To understand how deep it runs, consider the numbers nobody publishes. The royal family's known residences require hundreds of staff: butlers, cooks, housekeepers, gamekeepers, gardeners, security teams, maintenance workers. Many are paid through the sovereign grant, others through the duchies, and still others through arrangements that don't appear in any account. No one outside the palace can say precisely how many people are employed or what the true payroll cost is. Even Parliament's Public Accounts Committee has admitted that royal finances remain opaque. That opacity is what keeps the monarchy stable. When people can't see the structure, they can't argue about it. The system's beauty lies in its invisibility. Sandringham is described as a private retreat, Balmoral as a family home. Each phrase makes the estate sound small, domestic, even relatable. But Sandringham covers 20,000 acres and Balmoral 50,000, together larger than some English counties. The family calls them private because that word ends the conversation. It stops anyone from asking why taxpayers fund security or why the properties are exempt from inheritance tax. Privacy becomes the shield that protects privilege. There's an old idea in Britain that the monarchy is beyond politics. It sits above the fray, representing everyone. But real neutrality requires transparency. If an institution's wealth and power come from the public has the right to know how it's used. Instead, the royal household operates in a fog of partial truths. The palace releases just enough data to appear accountable, then draws the curtain before the real questions can begin. And the real questions are simple. Why does one family need more than 30 homes when most Britons struggle to afford one? Why are estates worth billions managed as private assets while their upkeep depends on public funds? Why is inheritance tax an obligation for every family except the one that defines the state itself? These are not anti-monarchy questions, they're questions of fairness, and fairness is the one word the palace never uses. What's remarkable is how consistent the pattern is. Whenever public interest starts to rise after a scandal, a documentary, or a debate about funding, the palace releases carefully chosen footage, the family walking to church at Christmas, smiling on the Balmoral lawns, chatting with locals. The message is always the same. Look, they're just like us. But the moment the cameras leave, the gates close again. The private jets land, the staff resume, and the accounts remain sealed. This secrecy has become the monarchy's survival mechanism. It protects not only the family's comfort, but the very idea of monarchy as a benign, apolitical institution. The less people know about the machinery of wealth behind the crown, the easier it is to maintain loyalty. For most of the 20th century, that worked. The late Queen's personal aura insulated the system from scrutiny. But her death exposed the fragility of that arrangement. Charles is respected, but not adored. William is popular, but bound by the same structures. The myths are thinner now, the questions harder to dismiss. There's an irony here. The monarchy insists on being both timeless and modern, both public and private, both symbolic and functional. But those contradictions can't coexist forever. You can't be a national symbol of unity while operating under laws that protect you from the same scrutiny faced by every public body. You can't speak of service while hiding the scale of privilege, and you can't call it family tradition when it looks increasingly like a multinational holding company with better architecture. The royal property empire isn't hidden because it's illegal or scandalous. It's hidden because visibility would change the conversation. If people could see the entire map, every castle, every mansion, every acre, they'd realize this isn't about heritage. It's about ownership. And ownership raises the one question the monarchy can't answer without undermining itself. Who does it all really belong to? For now, that question stays unasked, or at least unanswered. The public sees glimpses, headlines, carefully staged photos of tradition. The rest remains behind locked gates and unmarked ledgers. But every system built on secrecy eventually faces exposure. And when that day comes, when the full picture of the royal property network is finally visible, Britain will have to decide whether reverence can still survive transparency. Until then, the illusion holds. A handful of palaces in the public imagination, 30 estates in reality, 2 versions of monarchy, one symbolic, one tangible, and a carefully maintained silence separating the two. What lies behind that silence is where the real story begins. And it starts, fittingly, at the one house that embodies the contradiction more clearly than any other, the estate that defines royal tradition, privacy, and public myth all at once. Sandringham House, the £200 million Christmas secret. Sandringham House looks like something out of an English Christmas card: red brick, ivy, chimneys cutting through winter fog. Each December, the same television shots appear. The royal family walking to church, dressed in coats and hats, waving politely to the waiting crowd. The message is simple, deliberate. Here's a family, just like yours, sharing a quiet country Christmas. But behind those brief images lies one of the most private, expensive, and carefully managed properties in Britain. Sandringham isn't just a home. It's a symbol, a royal illusion built across 20,000 acres of Norfolk countryside, quietly worth more than £200 million. The estate's story begins in 1862, when the future King Edward VII, then Prince of Wales, purchased the property for about $220,000. What would now be the equivalent of around $200 million. It wasn't an official crown property. He bought it privately, which means it became part of the royal family's personal portfolio, separate from the crown estate and from government oversight. That small distinction, private, has protected Sandringham from public scrutiny for more than a century and a half. The land has expanded steadily since then through acquisitions of neighboring farms and woodlands. Today, it's a working agricultural business, a royal retreat, and a fortress of privacy. The main house itself has around 270 rooms. That number alone is staggering. Dining halls, drawing rooms, bedrooms, servants' quarters, offices, nurseries, and a private museum. Not as large as Buckingham Palace, but enormous for something the family calls a home. It's built in the Jacobean style, with a long facade and endless architectural flourishes, a physical statement of prestige. Each monarch since Edward VII has changed something, an extension here, a new wing there. Elizabeth II modernized the kitchens and added new accommodation for staff. The estate also includes several smaller houses: York Cottage, once home to George I's Park House, where Princess Diana spent her childhood, and Anmer Hall, now the country residence of William and Catherine. From the outside, Sandringham looks like continuity, tradition solidified into brick and stone. But look closer and you see something more complex. The estate is technically private, but much of its operation relies on public structures. Security is handled by police, not private guards. Roads within the estate are maintained with council support. Even though it doesn't appear in Crown Estate accounts, Sandringham sits within a web of privilege built on blurred lines between public responsibility and private wealth. The costs of maintaining 20,000 acres are vast: landscaping, forestry, conservation, maintenance of historic buildings, and agricultural management. None of these figures are published, and none are subject to parliamentary oversight. The official story is that the estate funds itself through farming and tourism. On paper, it does host small tours. Visitors can book entry to the ground floor rooms and the gardens during summer months when the family isn't in residence. Tickets are sold, the gift shop bustles, and brochures emphasize how proceeds go back into maintaining the estate. But only a fraction of Sandringham is open, just enough to create the illusion of accessibility. 99% of the land and most of the buildings remain closed. It's a form of curated transparency. You see what they want you to see. When the royal family is there, usually from late December through early February, the entire estate becomes a restricted zone. Helicopters patrol the airspace. Locals are advised not to linger near the roads. For those few winter weeks, Sandringham transforms from a heritage site into a private fortress. Security costs skyrocket, and while the palace insists these are handled privately, the truth is murky. Security for the monarch is a state matter. Even when they're on private property, protection officers, police units, and logistical teams are deployed at public expense. The line between personal and official security simply doesn't exist at this level. This duality, public image, private reality, is what makes Sandringham such a revealing case. To the world, it's the monarch's cozy Christmas retreat. To accountants, it's an untouchable asset, shielded from inheritance tax and parliamentary oversight. When Elizabeth II died, Sandringham, like Balmoral, passed directly to Charles, without a single pound of tax paid. Most Britons pay 40% inheritance tax on estates over $325,000. The royal family pays none. The exemption was negotiated in 1993 under the justification of preserving national heritage. But Sandringham isn't public heritage, it's personal property. The reasoning might make sense for Buckingham Palace, which belongs to the state, but it stretches credibility when applied to a private estate that generates private income. Those numbers matter. Sandringham produces millions annually from farming, shooting, and tenant rents. The estate employs gamekeepers, foresters, and agricultural workers. It also runs a lucrative shooting operation, one of the most famous in the country. For over a century, the Sandringham shoots have drawn wealthy guests, business leaders, and politicians. Pheasants are driven across the estate in traditional hunts, and participants pay thousands for the privilege. For years, Prince Philip managed the shoots personally, enforcing strict rules and cultivating what insiders describe as military precision. To some, it's an example of rural tradition. To others, it's an outdated display of privilege and violence. Either way, it's private. No journalists, no cameras, no scrutiny. What's discussed on those weekends, who attends, and what deals are formed remain unknown. Occasionally, fragments of the hidden reality surface. Former staff have spoken quietly about the scale of operations, the logistics of maintaining a property so large, the constant pressure to ensure perfection before the family's arrival, the number of staff required even when the royals aren't there. But such stories rarely make headlines. The palace controls the narrative, and the press, still reliant on royal access, rarely challenges it directly. The deeper issue isn't the luxury, it's the contradiction. The monarchy presents itself as modern, relatable, concerned with environmental issues and social equality. Yet the very existence of Sandringham undermines that image. The estate's hunting culture, tax exemptions, and secrecy sit uneasily beside public statements about sustainability and fairness. Charles has spoken repeatedly about environmental stewardship and organic farming. Some of Sandringham's land has indeed shifted toward more sustainable practices. But the idea of sustainable aristocracy is hard to sell when the estate remains inaccessible to the people whose taxes protect it. There's also the matter of inheritance. Sandringham passes privately from monarch to heir, circumventing tax through special arrangements agreed upon by the government. The justification is continuity, the idea that these homes are essential to the monarchy's role and should be preserved intact. But preservation comes at a cost measured not just in money, but in trust. Each time a monarch inherits untaxed wealth, the message is clear. The rules are different for them. The palace defends this as necessary for stability. Ordinary citizens see it as inequality enshrined in law. What Sandringham truly reveals is how the modern monarchy functions as a business disguised as tradition. It's an enterprise built on land, history, and the performance of normality. The family walks to church because that image reassures the public. The cameras film from a respectful distance, capturing smiles and waves, while behind them stretches a vast private domain that the nation will never fully see. Every shot is choreography. Every glimpse is controlled. When journalists ask why the estate isn't open more extensively, the palace answers with the usual words: privacy and security. It's reasonable. No one expects tourists wandering through the gardens while the king unwraps presents. But that explanation doesn't account for the rest of the year. Other historic estates across Britain open fully during off-seasons, balancing preservation with public access. Sandringham doesn't. It doesn't need to. The monarchy has no incentive to open the doors wider, because openness erodes mystique, and mystique is part of its currency. There's a quiet irony here. Sandringham, with its manicured lawns and polished myth of family simplicity, has become the clearest window into how the monarchy sustains itself. Every element, the private ownership, the public protection, the curated tours, the hidden accounts, represents the broader structure that keeps royal privilege intact. The estate is not a relic of the past. It's a functioning model of how hereditary power adapts to democracy without surrendering its advantages. Sandringham endures because it feels harmless, almost sentimental. It's Christmas cards, nostalgia, corgis, and candlelight. It's the Queen smiling under gray skies, surrounded by grandchildren. No one wants to spoil that picture, but the warmth of the image hides the chill of its reality. 200 million pounds of land and property held privately by the head of state, protected from taxation, maintained in part by public systems, and wrapped in secrecy so thick that even Parliament can't pierce it. And yet, this secrecy isn't just about protecting the king's privacy. It's about preserving an institution built on contradiction. The monarchy depends on being seen, but only in carefully chosen frames. Sandringham provides those frames. It shows just enough to humanize the family and hides enough to maintain their mystery. The same place that hosts the Smiling Christmas Walk also houses boardrooms, archives, and operations that run year-round, unseen. When the cameras leave and the church bells fade, the gates close again. Behind them lies not just a house, but a statement, a reminder that monarchy in modern Britain isn't only about crowns and ceremonies. It's about property, power, and the quiet machinery that keeps both hidden. Sandringham is the perfect metaphor for that machinery, beautiful, controlled, and utterly opaque. It's where the myth of the normal family Christmas meets the reality of a private empire, and where the line between nation and dynasty disappears entirely. Balmoral Castle sits deep in the Scottish Highlands, 50,000 acres of forest, moor, and river where the air smells of pine and wet stone. The drive leading to it cuts through rolling hills and thick woods, miles from the nearest town. There are no walls topped with barbed wire, no electric fences or cameras visible from the road, yet the isolation itself is security. For the royal family, this isn't just a summer home. It's the one place where the outside world disappears. Balmoral is privacy measured in square miles, a billion-pound fortress disguised as wilderness. The story begins with Queen Victoria. She first visited the Highlands in 1848, 4 years after marrying Prince Albert. She was captivated by the landscape, its vastness, its silence, the sense of escape it offered from London's suffocating formality. Scotland was romanticized then. The novels of Walter Scott had turned tartan and heather into symbols of noble simplicity. Victoria bought into the fantasy completely. In 1852, she and Albert purchased the Balmoral estate with their own money, which meant that from the start it belonged not to the Crown, but to them personally. They demolished the old castle and built a new one, a granite palace designed in what became known as the Scottish baronial style. Turrets, battlements, and a clock tower that rose above the trees like a statement of possession. It wasn't Scottish in any authentic sense. It was an English monarch's idea of Scotland, an architectural performance of belonging. Albert oversaw the construction himself, down to the details of stonework and interior design. The result was impressive but deliberate, grandeur softened by rusticism, luxury wrapped in plaid. To the Victorian public, it symbolized domestic virtue. The queen who ruled an empire found solace in a rural home, living simply among her people. The myth of Balmoral was born there, a royal retreat that blurred privilege into pastoral charm. That myth still works today. When Elizabeth II spent summers at Balmoral, newspapers repeated the same phrases. Her Majesty's favorite home, a place of peace, where she can be herself. Each year, the family would arrive in August and stay until early October. The schedule never varied. Public events ceased, and the Queen was pictured walking her dogs or inspecting horses. The message was clear. Here, she wasn't the monarch. She was simply a woman who loved the countryside. It was an effective image because it was partly true. She did love it. She did find peace there. But the image left out the scale. 50,000 acres is 78 square miles, larger than Cambridge, nearly the size of the Isle of Jersey. It includes hills, forests, farmland, and dozens of estate cottages. The River Dee runs through it. There are working farms and managed forests. On paper, Balmoral is an agricultural business with employees ranging from gamekeepers to gardeners. In practice, it is one of the largest private estates in Scotland, with a valuation that exceeds £1 billion. The estate is open to visitors only a few months a year, and then only a fraction of it, the ballroom, gardens, a few outbuildings. Tickets are sold, photos are allowed, and tourists leave, believing they've seen Balmoral. They haven't. The royal family's actual residence, the castle, the lodges, the private grounds, is off limits. During the summer months when the family stays there, the estate becomes a closed world. Roads leading to the castle are monitored by police checkpoints. Locals who live on the periphery are used to the restrictions: no drones, no hiking beyond certain markers, no photographs. The house is invisible behind layers of landscape and protocol. Maintaining such a vast property is a logistical feat. The estate employs about 50 permanent staff: gamekeepers, forestry workers, farmhands, housekeepers, and maintenance crews. During royal visits, the workforce multiplies with additional security and service staff flown in from London. The cost runs into millions each year. Because Balmoral is privately owned, it doesn't appear in Crown Estate records, and the palace is not required to disclose its finances. Officially, it operates as a private business supported by tourism, farming, and forestry. But those income streams are minor compared to the expenses of keeping a castle habitable in the middle of the Highlands. Electricity, heating, road maintenance, preservation of historical structures, all are costly, and none are subject to public audit. When asked who pays, the palace points to private funds from the Duchy of Lancaster or from the estate's own revenues. But those funds exist because of royal privilege. Duchy income is tax-exempt, the product of inherited land managed by government-chartered entities. In other words, Balmoral is privately owned, publicly protected, and financially sustained by a system that blurs private and state wealth. The family insists this is tradition. Critics call it hypocrisy. Both are right. Balmoral's political role is quieter but significant. For Queen Victoria, the castle was a way of claiming Scotland symbolically, an act of soft colonization through architecture and culture. The tartan, the Highland Games, the bagpipes all became fixtures of royal life because they served a purpose. They transformed Scottish identity from a rebellious past into a loyal component of the British monarchy. The royal family still uses Balmoral to reinforce that connection. Photographs of Charles and Camilla walking the grounds, attending local church services, meeting neighbors. They all serve the same function as Victoria's early visits. A display of unity between crown and country at a time when Scottish independence remains a live political question. Balmoral isn't just personal heritage, it's political theater. Elizabeth II's death there in 2022 only deepened the symbolism. The world learned she had died peacefully at Balmoral. The phrase was repeated in every headline, every broadcast. It tied her final moment to the estate she loved most, reinforcing the idea of continuity. But beneath the sentiment lay a practical problem. Charles inherited Balmoral instantly, tax-free, because it was classified as private. The property that had been the Queen's sanctuary became part of his already enormous portfolio without a single financial obligation. For the public, Balmoral was a site of national mourning. For the monarchy, it was another example of how the system perpetuates itself. Charles's relationship with Balmoral is complicated. He appreciates the landscape but prefers Birkhall, a smaller house on the estate that once belonged to his grandmother. Birkhall is comfortable, personal, intimate. Balmoral Castle itself, grand and drafty, carries the weight of history and expectation. He can't sell it. Doing so would trigger political outrage, but he can retreat from it. Insiders say the castle may see less royal use under his reign, though it will remain maintained, staffed, and protected year-round. A billion-pound asset used for a few weeks each summer. That scale of exclusivity is hard to defend in modern Britain. Most large estates open widely to the public to justify tax breaks. Balmoral doesn't have to. It doesn't need to prove its worth. Its existence is self-justifying because it belongs to the monarchy. The public accepts this because they've been conditioned to see Balmoral as sentimental, not financial, a place of memory, not money. Yet the money matters. The maintenance, the staffing, the security, all come from somewhere. When the Home Office spends millions each year protecting the royal family on private land, those funds come from taxpayers. They're labeled national security, not royal expense, and therefore hidden from public view. The privacy of Balmoral also serves another function: control. Within those 50,000 acres, the family can live without cameras or observers. Every photo that emerges is approved. Every glimpse of the interiors is curated. In a world where every public figure lives under constant scrutiny, Balmoral provides the one thing the monarchy values more than wealth: an unobserved life. That privacy, though, comes with its own paradox. If a monarch needs 50,000 acres to feel normal, what does that say about the distance between royalty and the people they represent? There's a sense that Balmoral belongs to another century, when kings and queens needed to retreat into isolation to maintain mystique. Yet the monarchy still depends on that mystique today. The palace argues that opening Balmoral fully would compromise security and intrude on personal life. But the deeper reason is psychological. Mystique requires separation. The more the public knows, the less special it feels. So the castle stays closed, the land remains walled by geography, and the idea of Balmoral endures as a symbol of royal simplicity that exists only in story. Even among royal properties, Balmoral is unique because it fuses myth and materiality so perfectly. It's a working estate that produces timber and venison, yet it's also a stage set for the monarchy's most powerful narrative, the sovereign as a person of the land. The family's annual pilgrimage north is portrayed as a return to roots, a sign of humility. But it's humility with armed guards and private rivers, humility that cost millions to maintain. The contradiction isn't lost on the public, it's just quietly ignored. Over time, Balmoral has become both a sanctuary and a liability. It represents the best version of monarchy, the family close to nature, far from politics, and the worst, the extraordinary privilege that distance requires. The estate's vastness shields the family from scrutiny, but also isolates them from reality. Within its boundaries, time stands still. The rest of Britain moves on, debating taxes, facing austerity, struggling through housing crises, while the royal summer continues, uninterrupted since 1852. Perhaps that's why Balmoral feels so symbolic. It isn't just a castle in the Highlands, it's the physical manifestation of monarchy itself. Rooted in history, protected by tradition, immune to accountability. Its beauty conceals its cost. Its privacy conceals its politics. And every August, when the royal convoy disappears into those trees, Britain gets a brief glimpse of what the monarchy truly is. Not a family serving the nation, but a nation serving a family. 7 miles from Windsor Castle, tucked into the folds of Windsor Great Park, stands a house the royal family would rather not discuss. It isn't a palace or a fortress. From the air, it looks modest, an odd, triangular structure of pale stone with crenellated walls, built in the 1750s as a Gothic folly. Its name sounds regal but slightly absurd. Fort Belvedere. The place is infamous not for what it is, but for what happened there. On December 10, 1936, inside that quiet house, King Edward VIII signed the document that changed modern monarchy, the instrument of abdication. It was here, on Crown Estate land, that a king gave up his throne to marry an American divorcee. Everything that followed, the exile, the scandal, the reshaping of royal protocol, began in those rooms. For decades the family avoided mentioning it. The house became a ghost story, in stone. After Edward left Britain, Fort Belvedere sat empty. Nobody wanted to live in the place that symbolized failure. It was considered cursed, a reminder that personal desire and public duty don't mix. The Crown Estate, which technically owns the land, eventually leased it privately in 1955. The tenants were a wealthy Canadian family, the Westons, whose fortune came from retail and food businesses. The details of the lease were never disclosed. How long it lasts, how much they pay, what conditions apply. None of it appears in public records. The Crown Estate, despite being legally owned by the nation and managed in the public interest, rarely publishes information about individual royal properties. Fort Belvedere simply vanished from the public narrative, its windows shuttered, its history left unspoken. That silence serves a purpose. For the monarchy, Fort Belvedere represents vulnerability. It's the setting of their most destabilizing crisis of the 20th century, the moment when love outweighed duty, when a king chose himself over the crown. Modern royals avoid it because it raises questions about their own privileges and choices. When William and Kate were looking for a country home years ago, Fort Belvedere was briefly considered. Secluded, beautiful, near Windsor. It seemed perfect. But the optics were impossible. To live in the house where a king quit would invite constant comparisons, a symbolic echo of disloyalty. They chose Adelaide Cottage instead, a smaller property, far less loaded with history. The irony is that Fort Belvedere could have been repurposed as a museum, a historical site explaining the abdication crisis. But opening it to the public would mean acknowledging too much. The Crown prefers to forget its ghosts. So the house remains private, quietly leased, shielded by confidentiality. Even aerial photographs are rare. The estate is maintained, its lawns trimmed, but the story behind it stays buried. What the monarchy cannot erase, it obscures. If Fort Belvedere embodies the monarchy's forgotten past, another Windsor property represents its most recent embarrassment. Frogmore Cottage, less fortress, more suburban villa, sits on the edge of the Windsor estate, not far from the mausoleum where Queen Victoria and Prince Albert are buried. The building was originally constructed in 1801 for Queen Charlotte, then rebuilt in 1901. By the 21st century, it had become staff housing, divided into 5 small apartments. That anonymity ended in 2019 when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle moved in. Their arrival was supposed to signal renewal, a young, modern couple bringing fresh energy to the monarchy. Instead, Frogmore became a symbol of everything brittle about the institution. The cottage underwent a massive renovation costing £2.4 million, funded by the sovereign grant, the taxpayer-supported allowance that finances royal duties. The works included new plumbing, wiring, flooring, and extensive structural repair. Palace spokespeople insisted the renovation was necessary to make the property habitable. Critics called it an indulgence. Then, barely 10 months later, the couple announced they were stepping back from royal life. Within months, they had moved to California. The timing was disastrous. Millions in public money had just been spent refurbishing a house that now stood empty. Headlines branded it Frogmoregate. Under growing pressure, Harry eventually repaid the renovation cost, but only for the construction itself, not for furnishings, landscaping, or the ongoing security presence. Those additional expenses, estimated at hundreds of thousands annually, were never fully explained. The cottage, for a time, became a metaphor for royal contradiction, a publicly funded private home occupied by people who no longer wanted to serve the public. When Harry and Meghan left Britain, the house lingered in limbo. For a while, Princess Eugenie and her husband Jack Brooksbank lived there, though quietly, without fanfare. Later, reports surfaced that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had kept it as a UK base, paying rent but rarely using it. Then, in 2023, King Charles asked them to vacate entirely. The press portrayed this as part of a broader reshuffle, a symbolic reclaiming of royal property. But the real story remains obscure. The palace refuses to disclose who occupies Frogmore now. Official statements merely say it has been reallocated. No photographs, no confirmation, no numbers. The secrecy around Frogmore mirrors the secrecy around Fort Belvedere, but for opposite reasons. Fort Belvedere hides an old scandal. Frogmore hides a recent one. Both raise uncomfortable truths about privilege and accountability. In one, a king abandoned duty for love. In the other, a couple rejected duty because the institution refused to adapt. Both cases expose the same vulnerability, that beneath the ceremony, the monarchy is a family business, and like any business, it depends on image. When that image cracks, the walls close in. The financial side of Frogmore remains particularly murky. Even after Harry's repayment, questions lingered about the renovation process. Who approved the budget? What contractors were used? How were costs allocated between public and private accounts? These details were never released. The Sovereign Grant's annual report merely listed property refurbishment as a category. Parliamentary committees didn't pursue it further. The monarchy's finances exist in a gray zone where transparency is voluntary and questions are quietly discouraged. That lack of accountability is precisely what critics find indefensible. The monarchy often justifies its privileges through the idea of service, that the institution exists to unify the country, and that its members accept scrutiny in return for that privilege. But the reality is reversed. The palace controls scrutiny, granting or denying access as it pleases. Fort Belvedere and Frogmore illustrate that perfectly. One property sealed off from history, another sealed off from the present. The problem isn't that these houses exist, it's that the public, who indirectly funds their maintenance, is denied even the most basic information about them. The Crown Estate manages properties in the public interest, but it treats royal residences as exceptions. Lease terms remain confidential. Security costs are filed under national security and hidden from public ledgers. When controversy arises, the institution responds not with transparency, but with silence. It's a silence polished over centuries until it feels like tradition. Both houses also show how selective the monarchy's sense of memory can be. It celebrates certain histories, jubilees, weddings, victories, while quietly burying the rest. Fort Belvedere could teach the nation about duty and sacrifice, the cost of monarchy in human terms. Frogmore could be an example of how modern expectations clash with ancient systems. Instead, both are locked away, stories sanitized into footnotes. The official royal website doesn't even mention Fort Belvedere by name. The broader pattern is clear. When something threatens the institution's image, it disappears. The physical properties become metaphors for this erasure. Behind the gilded gates, inconvenient history waits out of sight until public attention drifts elsewhere. Yet the reminders keep returning through investigative journalism, through documentaries, through the occasional line in a budget report that doesn't quite add up. Perhaps that's why these two houses feel linked despite their different eras. Fort Belvedere was the site of a king's surrender to emotion. Frogmore became the symbol of a couple's escape from tradition. In both cases, the monarchy lost control of the story and spent years trying to reclaim it. The architecture stands as witness. Drive past Fort Belvedere today, and you'll see little more than treetops and fences. The road bends away as if deliberately steering visitors elsewhere. Frogmore Cottage is equally hidden, tucked behind rows of trees within Windsor Home Park. Tourists walk the nearby paths, unaware they're passing some of the most controversial real estate in Britain. The silence feels deliberate, protective. Both properties are maintained, guarded, insured, small pieces of a vast empire of land whose true boundaries remain a state secret. There's a quiet irony in that. The monarchy presents itself as the keeper of Britain's history, the guardian of heritage. Yet its own history, its physical, material legacy, is locked away from the people it claims to represent. Fort Belvedere and Frogmore aren't just buildings. They're reminders of how the Crown manages memory, by owning it, fencing it, and deciding which parts of it the public gets to see. What happened behind their walls, the signatures, the departures, the unspoken negotiations, continues to shape the royal family's present. But you won't find plaques or guided tours explaining it. The only story told is the official one, quiet houses on royal land, maintained through private means. No mention of the money, the scandal, or the symbolism. Only the silence, immaculate as ever. The royal family likes to speak about modernization. They say the monarchy must evolve to survive, that the next generation will be more relatable, more transparent, more in touch with ordinary people. Yet when you look at where those younger royals actually live, the pattern doesn't look modern at all. It looks inherited, protected, and as secretive as ever. Their homes, Anmer Hall, Highgrove House, and Burke Hall, tell the story of a family that talks about change but practices continuity. Each is wrapped in the same old language of privacy, duty, and heritage, phrases that make privilege sound like responsibility. Anmer Hall sits on the edge of the Sandringham estate, a Georgian manor with 10 bedrooms, long lawns, and the kind of silence that only deep countryside provides. The house was a wedding gift from the late Queen Elizabeth II to Prince William and Catherine in 2011. It's described in polite terms as a country home, as if that means a weekend escape with a garden. In reality, it's a mansion surrounded by fields and high hedges, with its own walled garden and private drive. The public never sees it directly, photographs are rare, and when they do surface, they're distant, taken from the road with long lenses before being quickly challenged by royal protection officers. When the couple moved in, the house underwent major renovations estimated between £1.5 and £3 million, funded through the Duchy of Cornwall. The duchy, worth over £1 billion, exists to provide income to the heir to the throne. It's technically private property, yet its privileges stem entirely from royal status, tax exemptions, historic land holdings, and public protections. The money used to restore Anmer Hall therefore wasn't public in the legal sense, but couldn't exist without public structures. That gray area defines the monarchy's finances, the ability to spend freely while maintaining plausible deniability. Officially, the renovations focused on modernization, new roof, updated plumbing, energy efficiency, rewiring, and extensive landscaping. The interiors remain unseen. The palace released no images beyond one staged photograph showing the couple with their children sitting in a modest-looking room meant to suggest simplicity. The illusion is careful. Even when the family lived there full-time between 2015 and 2017, journalists were kept away, and details were treated as state secrets. The justification, repeated endlessly, was the protection of their children's privacy. No one disputes that children deserve privacy, but the scope of secrecy extends far beyond that. It shields the scale of privilege, not just the family's personal life. Anmer Hall embodies the contradiction of the modern monarchy. It exists to project normality while operating on terms that are anything but normal. 10 bedrooms for a family of 5, full-time staff, permanent security presence, and an annual upkeep cost that would cripple any private household. Even when the family isn't there, security teams patrol, gardens are maintained, utilities run. Who pays for that? Officially, security costs for senior royals are classified and never disclosed. In practice, they're covered through a mix of Home Office funding and police budgets, meaning taxpayers. So while the property itself is private, its protection remains public. The pattern continues with Highgrove House, Charles's long-standing country estate in Gloucestershire. He purchased it in 1980 through the Duchy of Cornwall for $750,000, a modest figure at the time for a property of such scale. The house is 18th century Georgian, surrounded by rolling farmland and meticulously designed gardens. It's become central to Charles's personal mythology. The eco-conscious prince cultivating wildflower meadows, leading the way in sustainable agriculture, proving that heritage and environmentalism can coexist. To his credit, some of that is genuine. He transformed Highgrove's grounds into a model of organic farming decades before it became fashionable. He sells products from the estate through the Highgrove brand, the profits of which go to charity. But the presentation hides its own contradictions. The house itself remains entirely private. Tourists can visit the gardens by appointment, paying a steep fee for guided tours scheduled months in advance. The tours are limited, tightly controlled, and curated to the last detail. Visitors see what Charles wants them to see: flowers, hedgerows, compost heaps, proof of his vision. The house remains off-limits. No photographs of its interiors, no public accounting of its renovations or security arrangements. Even now, as king, Charles retains personal use of the estate, despite the duchy, its legal owner, transferring to his son William upon succession. The arrangement is opaque. When Charles became king, Highgrove should have reverted fully to the new Prince of Wales, along with the rest of the duchy's holdings. Instead, Charles negotiated to keep it as his private home through an undisclosed financial agreement. Presumably, he now pays rent to the duchy, though the terms remain secret. It's an unusual situation, the monarch renting property from his own heir, using money that originates from duchy income that still benefits his family. The palace has never explained how this circular funding actually works, and no law requires them to. To the outside world, it looks tidy, a king who loves his garden. To those who look closer, it's a closed loop of inherited privilege disguised as sustainability. Yet Highgrove's charm is undeniable. The estate has become an emblem of Charles's identity, the one part of his life that feels personally shaped rather than inherited. It's also his refuge, the place where he meets friends away from cameras, where decisions are made quietly, without civil servants or courtiers nearby. When politicians visit, they call it relaxed diplomacy. But every fence, flower, and hedge there is maintained by a network of resources that stems from public office. The separation between the man and the monarchy doesn't really exist, even among the Roses. Further north lies Burke Hall, a white-painted Georgian house on the Balmoral estate. The Queen Mother bought it in the 1930s, and it became one of her favorite homes. When she died in 2002, Charles inherited it privately, along with the surrounding land. Compared to Balmoral's vastness, Burke Hall feels human, 15 or 20 rooms, warm rather than imposing, surrounded by wooded hills and fishing rivers. It's where Charles and Camilla spend their Scottish summers now, choosing intimacy over grandeur. They even honeymooned there in 2005. In photographs released to mark anniversaries, they appear beside fireplaces or garden paths, the setting always tranquil, timeless. But for all its intimacy, Burke Hall is arguably the most secretive of all royal properties. No full images of the interiors have ever been released. No documentaries have been filmed there. No detailed information exists about its operations. The property has become the king's true sanctuary, the place where the public persona stops. He spends weeks there each year, reading, painting, walking. It's the closest he comes to privacy. Yet even here, the distinction between personal and public funding remains vague. The estate lies within Balmoral's boundaries, meaning it benefits from the same infrastructure: security patrols, maintenance staff, transport, largely supported through the same gray pool of mixed royal and public money. The secrecy surrounding Burke Hall reveals something essential about monarchy. For all its pageantry, it depends on invisibility. The institution's legitimacy comes from being seen at a distance, visible but unknowable. Burke Hall provides that distance in physical form. It's an invisible kingdom within a larger private empire. If you were to drive through the Highlands, you'd never find it. Signs simply vanish near its turnoff, and locals keep directions vague. To reach it, one passes through multiple gates, each guarded by people whose salaries are quietly funded by a system no one outside the palace can fully trace. Together, Anmer Hall, Highgrove, and Burke Hall represent the next generation's monarchy. Less ostentatious than Buckingham Palace, but no less protected. They're portrayed as examples of modest living, proof that the family has scaled back. In truth, they show how modern royalty refines excess rather than reduces it. The grandeur is subtler, disguised as country living. The palaces have become manors, the servants have become staff, and the wealth has become heritage. Each property operates as a stage. At Anmer Hall, the image is family life, children playing, parents balancing work and duty. At Highgrove, it's stewardship, gardens, sustainability, moral leadership. At Burke Hall, it's retreat, quiet reflection, legacy, continuity. 3 sets, 3 narratives, all built around one idea: the monarchy as natural, wholesome, and inevitable. Yet behind every narrative is the same pattern of privilege, secrecy, and insulation from accountability. If these estates were owned by a corporation, they would be subject to audits, property taxes, and annual disclosures. Instead, they exist in a royal loophole where privacy masquerades as necessity. The palace insists that these homes are essential to the family's ability to function. Without them, they claim, they couldn't perform their roles effectively. But the truth is simpler. These houses aren't about function. They're about identity. They preserve the illusion of monarchy as a lifestyle that somehow transcends money, even as every brick and acre is defined by it. Modernization in this light isn't reform, it's rebranding. The younger royals present themselves as accessible figures, parents juggling work and family, advocates for mental health and environmental causes. Their homes are props in that performance, hidden enough to remain aspirational, but not so hidden that they seem alien. When glossy magazines describe Anmer Hall's warm rustic charm, or when royal social media posts show gardens in bloom, the message is clear. We're just like you, only better. And perhaps that's the quiet genius of the monarchy. It adapts without yielding, changes its costume while keeping the same script. The old palaces of power become private retreats. The aristocratic estates are recast as family homes. The cost remains the same, only the language shifts. Anmer Hall, Highgrove, Burke Hall, 3 homes that prove the monarchy can evolve endlessly, as long as no one asks too closely who's paying the bills. When people talk about the minor royals, they usually mean the ones who don't appear on balcony photos, the siblings and cousins who attend official events occasionally but live mostly out of view. They're the quieter generation, the supporting cast. Yet what they own, or rather what they occupy, tells you as much about the monarchy as any crown or carriage. Their homes, Bagshot Park, Gatcombe Park, and Royal Lodge, are not just houses. They're case studies in how royal privilege extends beyond visibility, how even those with no real public role still benefit from arrangements that most citizens could never dream of. Take Prince Edward, the King's youngest brother. Officially, he's the Duke of Edinburgh, a working royal who carries out engagements but rarely makes headlines. His home is Bagshot Park, a sprawling mansion in Surrey about 10 miles south of Windsor. The house has 57 rooms, sits on 51 acres, and looks more like a small hotel than a private residence. It was built in 1879 and rebuilt after a fire in 1913. Once used as military accommodation, it was converted for royal use in the 20th century. In 1999, Edward and his wife Sophie took up residence after negotiating a 150-year lease with the Crown Estate for £5 million. That figure might sound substantial until you realize what it buys. A 150-year lease on a state-owned mansion, effectively giving them lifetime use at a fraction of market value. The details of the agreement have never been published. No one knows the rent schedule, the maintenance obligations, or how much of that $5 million came from Edward's own funds versus family resources. The Crown Estate describes the arrangement as commercially confidential, even though it involves property owned by the public. What is known is that the estate pays for structural upkeep, while Edward covers internal maintenance and utilities. But what counts as structural versus internal? No one outside the palace can say. Bagshot Park's scale is staggering for someone 11th in line to the throne. Edward and Sophie reportedly converted part of it into offices for their production company, Ardent, which has long since closed. The rest remains private residence. The most famous room is the Indian billiard room, decorated in the 1880s with carved wood panels and a vaulted ceiling funded by Indian princes under British rule. It's beautiful, historic, and politically uncomfortable, a relic of empire now serving as a private lounge. When the property needed major repairs before the couple moved in, contractors and costs were arranged through the Crown Estate, not publicly itemized. The justification is always the same. This isn't indulgence, it's preservation. The estate, they say, must be lived in to stay maintained. But preservation for whom? The Crown Estate manages properties worth more than £15 billion on behalf of the nation. Its profits go to the Treasury. Yet when royal family members lease Crown Estate houses, those leases vanish behind a curtain of confidentiality. It's a pattern repeated across the royal portfolio, public assets used privately, under terms never fully disclosed. Contrast that with Princess Anne, Edward's sister, who has cultivated an image as the family's workhorse. She performs hundreds of engagements each year, often in sensible tweed and muddy boots, giving the impression of no-nonsense simplicity. Her home, Gatcombe Park, reinforces that image, but still demonstrates how royal privilege functions quietly. Gatcombe Park lies in Gloucestershire, roughly halfway between Bristol and Oxford, a 730-acre estate purchased by the Queen in 1976 as a wedding gift for Anne and her then-husband, Mark Phillips. The cost at the time was about $750,000, drawn from the Duchy of Lancaster, which means technically private funds derived from public privilege. Today, the property is valued at over £7 million. The main house is a Georgian manor with 12 bedrooms, modest by royal standards, but still a grand country home. Anne's life there seems grounded. She runs it as a working farm, raising cattle and sheep, and she hosts an annual equestrian event that attracts riders from across Europe. The estate generates its own income through agriculture, rentals, and ticketed events, which is unusual among royal properties. In interviews, Anne emphasizes that Gatcombe is practical rather than opulent. She calls it a real home, which in her case might actually be true. Still, the comfort is relative. Gatcombe's tax arrangements remain opaque. Because the purchase came from the duchy, no inheritance or capital gains tax was paid. The estate's growth in value over nearly 50 years, roughly tenfold, represents untaxed generational wealth protected by royal status. Anne is respected because she appears industrious and self-reliant. Her home reinforces that narrative, a princess living on a farm, feeding horses, avoiding fuss. Yet even her simplicity depends on structural privilege. Her security is taxpayer-funded. Her land was gifted tax-free. Her position ensures that her property can pass to her children without the obligations ordinary families face. Gatcombe may look like the monarchy's humble face, but it's still part of the same system that shields wealth from scrutiny. And then there's Prince Andrew, the family's problem child, whose home, Royal Lodge, has become an embarrassment impossible to ignore. Located within Windsor Great Park, Royal Lodge is a 30-room mansion set on 98 acres, once home to the Queen Mother. When she died in 2002, Andrew secured a 75-year lease from the Crown Estate in 2003 for a reported rent of $250 per week. That's not a typo, $250 a week, less than many London flats. In exchange, he was required to cover all maintenance and renovations. The house needed work, and Andrew spent an estimated £7.5 million refurbishing it. But the question everyone asks is, with what money? His naval pension and royal allowance couldn't cover that sum. Some reports say the Queen helped, others suggest funds from obscure business dealings. The palace has never clarified. What's certain is that Royal Lodge became his stronghold, both literally and figuratively. After the Epstein scandal destroyed his public reputation, Andrew lost his military titles, his patronages, and the ability to represent the monarchy. Yet he remained at Royal Lodge, protected by the lease he negotiated 20 years earlier. Even the king cannot evict him easily without a legal battle. Charles has reportedly urged his brother to downsize to Frogmore Cottage, smaller, cheaper, less offensive to public opinion. But Andrew refuses. For him, the house is more than comfort. It's proof of relevance. He's clinging to it because without it, he becomes just another disgraced man, not a prince. The arrangement exposes how fragile the idea of accountability is within the royal system. In theory, Crown estate land belongs to the nation. In practice, it serves as a private safety net for family members who fall from grace. Andrew's situation also highlights the hidden costs of royal maintenance. 30 rooms require constant care, heating, staff, groundskeeping. Even if he's technically responsible for the bills, it's difficult to believe he can fund them on his current resources. The palace won't confirm whether the family provides quiet financial support. The public just sees the outcome, a man stripped of duty but still living in a mansion, untouched by consequence. If Edward's Bagshot Park demonstrates privilege wrapped in respectability, and Anne's Gatcombe Park shows duty softened by rural charm, then Andrew's Royal Lodge lays the system bare. It's an arrangement that can't be defended by tradition or service. It survives only because of the secrecy built into royal property law. Breaking the lease would invite headlines, expose internal finances, and force the monarchy to admit that not all its members can afford the lifestyles they lead. Silence, as always, is safer. The contrast between the siblings is instructive. Anne's work ethic wins public approval. Edward's quiet compliance earns tolerance. Andrew's scandals provoke disgust. Yet all three live within structures that rely on the same privileges: land gifted or leased under special conditions, income from duchies or royal connections, exemptions from inheritance and property taxes. The moral outcomes differ. The financial foundation doesn't. Bagshot Park's 150-year lease hides its true cost. Gatcombe Park's tax-free growth hides its privilege under productivity. Royal Lodge's absurd rent hides disgrace under legality. Together, they illustrate the monarchy's ecosystem of property: vast, interconnected, quietly subsidized. Every generation inherits not only the land, but the logic that royal homes are sacrosanct, beyond audit, immune to market rules. This is why calls for transparency rarely succeed. To publish the full terms of these arrangements would be to expose how deeply the monarchy's wealth depends on the state. The system isn't about grandeur, it's about insulation. The minor royals live in comfort precisely so the major ones can appear restrained. The extravagance is distributed downward where scrutiny is weaker. None of this means the family lives without constraint. They are trapped in their own way inside the same gilded network that protects them. They can't easily sell, move, or downsize without royal approval. Their homes are both privilege and prison. Yet for the public, that distinction hardly matters. What most people see is the imbalance: ordinary citizens paying soaring rents while a handful of royals occupy country estates for life at token prices. Over time, these properties accumulate symbolic weight. They become shorthand for everything Britain struggles with: inequality, stagnation, nostalgia for hierarchy. The royal household treats them as family assets. The government treats them as off-limits. And so they endure, unchanged, generation after generation, invisible, monuments to an old order that still shapes the present. Bagshot Park, Gatcombe Park. Royal Lodge, 3 addresses, 3 ways of being royal without being central. They reveal that even on the margins, the system functions perfectly. Loyalty rewarded with security, discretion rewarded with luxury, scandal absorbed by silence. Every acre of land, every locked gate, every confidential lease ensures that the monarchy's wealth remains intact and its reach unbroken. For a family built on continuity, that's the ultimate achievement: survival not through reform, but through the careful art of never letting anyone see how the system really works. Every royal residence, from the smallest cottage to the grandest castle, connects to a financial network designed to look ancient and harmless, but structured with modern precision. It's a machine built to protect privilege through complexity. At its center are a few key instruments: the sovereign grant, the crown estate, and the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall. Each is presented as an innocent mechanism of tradition. Together they form a self-sustaining cycle where money moves quietly between public and private columns, erasing accountability as it goes. The public sees only the surface. Each year the palace releases its glossy report: revenue, expenditure, the reassuring phrase, cost to the taxpayer. The numbers look modest. In 2022-23, the sovereign grant was $86.3 million, equivalent to $129 per person. The palace highlights this comparison proudly: a coffee cup price for monarchy. The report lists travel expenses, staffing, property maintenance, and community projects. It feels transparent, but it isn't. The sovereign grant covers only one corner of the royal finances, the portion Parliament formally approves. It doesn't include security, inheritance, or private estate income. Those areas, the most expensive and least defensible, are hidden behind other budgets. Security is the largest invisible cost. Royal protection falls under national security, handled through the Home Office and Metropolitan Police. Because those departments do not break down expenses by category, no one outside government knows what the annual bill really is. Estimates range from $100 million to more than $200 million a year. Every property where a royal stays triggers a new layer of protection: guards, surveillance, local coordination. Each visit to Sandringham, Balmoral, or Windsor requires a separate security footprint. The bill is dispersed across agencies, impossible to track. Politicians avoid the topic. No one wants to be the minister who tries to cut the king's protection budget. That secrecy extends to the Crown estate, often misunderstood as the family's private portfolio. In theory, the Crown estate belongs to the monarch in right of the Crown, meaning it's not personal property, but an asset held in trust for the nation. In practice, the distinction blurs. The estate owns land and buildings valued at more than $15 billion, including Regent Street, much of London's West End, and vast areas of countryside and coastline. Its profits, around $440 million annually, go to the Treasury. The monarch then receives a percentage of those profits as the sovereign grant, currently set at 12%. On paper, that looks like a fair exchange, but the arrangement hides centuries of accumulated advantage. The Crown estate's holdings were built through conquest, confiscation, and royal privilege. To describe it now as a neutral public body ignores how those assets came to exist in the first place. Where the system becomes particularly murky is when Crown estate properties are leased to members of the royal family. Technically, those leases are commercial transactions. In reality, they're negotiated privately and never disclosed. Prince Edward's $5 million 150-year lease on Bagshot Park or Prince Andrew's $250 per week deal at Royal Lodge are both Crown estate arrangements. No one outside the palace knows the exact terms or whether they reflect market value. Because the Crown estate's accounts aggregate results, these family leases disappear into statistical averages. The public sees only overall profit, not individual privilege. Then come the duchies, the real engines of royal wealth. The Duchy of Lancaster belongs to the reigning monarch. The Duchy of Cornwall belongs to the heir. Both were created centuries ago to provide income independent of Parliament, ensuring royal self-sufficiency. That independence has become their shield. The Duchy of Lancaster currently provides the king with around $24 million annually, described as private income. The Duchy of Cornwall provides William with roughly $23 million. Neither pays corporation tax. Both are exempt from capital gains tax. When Charles was Prince of Wales, he voluntarily paid income tax on part of his duchy income, but only voluntarily, and only on his own terms. These estates are immense. The Duchy of Lancaster includes more than 18,000 hectares of rural land and valuable commercial properties across England. The Duchy of Cornwall owns more than 200 square miles of farmland, forests, and urban developments, including the model town of Poundbury. Each duchy operates as a modern corporate group with subsidiaries, directors, and real estate ventures. But unlike corporations, they are not answerable to shareholders or regulators. Their profits belong entirely to the royal family. When questioned, palace spokespeople describe the duchies as private. When challenged, they emphasize their public purpose. The words change depending on what's being defended. Privacy when it's about taxes, public service when it's about legitimacy. That semantic dance is central to how royal wealth remains untouchable. When the monarch inherits property, it's described as private, ensuring no inheritance tax. When the state pays for maintenance, Or security, the same property is suddenly part of the nation's heritage, justifying public expense. When the duchies invest, they are treated as private businesses. When they face criticism, they're called constitutional institutions. Every rule bends in two directions, depending on what's convenient. Maintenance is another gray zone. Buckingham Palace's renovation is openly funded by the sovereign grant, $369 million spread over 10 years. It's presented as a public infrastructure project, which it is. But other properties, Sandringham, Balmoral, Highgrove, require constant upkeep with no public accounting. The duchies release summaries, but no property-level data. Staff, contractors, and suppliers are paid through a mixture of duchy income and private accounts. The result is a network of employees whose work supports royal comfort, yet doesn't appear in official numbers. A palace insider once described the finances as a system designed for plausible deniability. No single ledger shows the whole picture. Costs are divided between departments, grants, estates, and trusts. Even if Parliament demanded full transparency, the data simply doesn't exist in a unified form. The opacity isn't a bug, it's the system's defining feature. The tax privileges are perhaps the most egregious. In 1993, the government and Queen Elizabeth II reached an agreement. The monarch would voluntarily pay income tax on her personal income, but royal estates would remain exempt from inheritance tax. The reasoning was that property like Balmoral and Sandringham should stay intact for the nation's benefit. Yet these estates are private, not public. When Elizabeth died in 2022, Charles inherited them, worth hundreds of millions, without paying a penny in tax. The same exemption will apply when he passes them to William. The effect is generational compounding. Royal wealth grows without interruption, while ordinary citizens lose nearly half their estate value to taxes. The palace insists that the monarchy is good value, that it generates tourism worth billions. But tourism tied to royal landmarks would continue even without living royals. People visit Versailles, the Vatican, and castles across Europe long after monarchies have lost power. What persists is architecture, not aristocracy. The idea that the Windsors personally sustain Britain's tourism economy is propaganda repeated so often it sounds plausible. If the numbers were ever fully exposed, the image of a self-funding monarchy would collapse. Add up the sovereign grant, the hidden security costs, the tax exemptions, and the untaxed duchy profits, and estimates of the monarchy's real cost range between $300 and $500 million a year. That doesn't include the indirect subsidies, police overtime during royal events, government staff assigned to support, or diplomatic travel linked to royal duties. The public funds it all, often without realizing it. The palace's defense is always heritage. They say these assets belong to the fabric of Britain, that the monarchy's wealth is not personal but institutional. Yet institution and person are inseparable here. When a monarch uses Balmoral, that's a private visit. When Balmoral needs protection, that's a national duty. When Balmoral changes hands, that's family inheritance exempt from tax. The lines blur until accountability vanishes entirely. The same logic applies to staffing. The official household employs roughly 500 people, paid through the sovereign grant. But each estate has its own workforce: housekeepers, gardeners, gamekeepers, drivers, maintenance teams. None of those salaries appear in official reports. Balmoral alone employs 50 permanent staff. Sandringham employs dozens more. They're paid from private funds, meaning duchy income generated by lands that exist only because of public authority. In effect, taxpayers fund the conditions that allow the monarchy to claim independence. This structure is remarkably resilient. It has survived wars, recessions, and shifting governments because it operates through habit rather than law. Each new agreement builds on the last, cementing privilege while appearing incremental. Even attempts at reform reinforce the system. When the sovereign grant replaced the civil list in 2011, it was marketed as modernization, a transparent percentage of Crown estate profits instead of opaque parliamentary votes. But the percentage itself created a self-expanding budget. As the Crown estate's value rose, so did royal income. When offshore wind farms were added to Crown estate assets, the grant ballooned further. The government eventually capped it at 12%, but only after public outcry. Transparency revealed nothing, it merely legitimized higher spending. This is the monarchy's genius, to transform dependence into autonomy, privilege into tradition, wealth into service. Every financial mechanism reinforces the same illusion, that the Crown costs nothing because it's part of Britain's identity, that scrutiny is unpatriotic, that secrecy equals stability. It's an architecture of opacity polished until it looks like heritage. Behind the speeches about duty and sustainability, behind the PR photos of family life and charitable work, lies this enduring reality. The royal family is the most protected landlord in the country, immune from taxes, shielded from audits, and supported by a population that rarely sees the full bill. The system has been perfected over centuries, not to enrich openly, but to enrich invisibly, allowing the monarchy to thrive in an era that should have rendered it obsolete. For most people, it's easier not to look. The numbers are abstract, the castles picturesque. Yet every hidden cost, every untaxed estate, every secret lease threads into the same story. A structure built to preserve power by concealing it. The monarchy's finances aren't merely opaque, they're the reason the institution still exists. The monarchy survives by staying slightly out of focus. People see crowns and ceremonies, balcony waves and charity galas, but not the architecture behind it, the layers of land, law, and money that keep it standing. As long as that structure remains blurred, the illusion works. But illusions are fragile things. Britain is changing faster than the Crown can adapt, and nowhere is the tension clearer than in the royal property empire. 30 homes for one family in a country where millions struggle to rent a single flat. Billions in assets, none fully taxed. Centuries of inherited wealth defended by the same words: duty, service, heritage. The story has held for generations. The question now is how much longer it can. King Charles took the throne promising a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, lower costs, more transparency. It sounded like reform, but the evidence suggests it's cosmetic. The core structure hasn't shifted. The royal family still holds direct access to at least a dozen major estates and indirectly controls more through duchies and trusts. The staffing, the security, the maintenance all continue under the same opaque arrangements. The only thing slimmer is the narrative. They speak the language of modernity while living inside a system designed for another age. The contradiction is becoming harder to hide. Britain faces its worst housing shortage in generations. Home ownership has collapsed among the young, and rents consume half of many workers' income. Nurses, teachers, and police officers, the same people who line the roads at royal parades, often can't afford housing in the cities they serve. Against that backdrop, the idea of one family holding 30 residences begins to feel grotesque. When politicians call for sacrifice and austerity, royal images of wealth no longer look like national pride. They look like feudalism that never ended. Public tolerance depends on distance. As long as the monarchy feels symbolic, people accept it. The problem with property is that it isn't symbolic. It's tangible. Land can't be hidden behind ceremony forever. Every photograph of a royal garden or gilded hallway reminds people that this is real wealth, not metaphor. And once that awareness spreads, the social contract that shields the crown begins to erode. Charles knows this, and he tries to manage perception carefully. His environmentalism, his emphasis on heritage conservation, his insistence that the monarchy serves a unifying purpose, all are attempts to justify privilege through moral language. It's not enough to own, one must own virtuously. The same logic underpins the limited public access to certain estates. Allow visitors into one ballroom at Balmoral or one garden at Highgrove, and it becomes proof of openness. But controlled access isn't transparency, it's marketing. It reinforces the idea that the public should be grateful for a glimpse rather than entitled to understanding. The most glaring challenge lies with the next generation. William and Catherine embody the monarchy's future image: young, modern, approachable. They speak about mental health, homelessness, environmental responsibility. They are careful, disciplined, photogenic. But when William stands on stage urging empathy for the homeless, the question hovers unspoken. Empathy from where? From Anmer Hall with its 10 bedrooms? From Kensington Palace, where rent is a concept that doesn't apply? Inheriting Sandringham and Balmoral will only amplify the contradiction. The moment William becomes king, he will add 2 vast private estates to his existing properties, making him one of the largest individual landowners in the country. No amount of PR polish can make that align with his advocacy for social equality. Charles faces a similar moral trap. He has built his public identity around stewardship, care for the land, care for tradition. But stewardship implies accountability. You cannot claim to be caretaker of the nation's heritage while shielding that heritage from public scrutiny. Every attempt at openness has stopped short of real reform. The Sovereign Grant Report, for all its color charts and statistics, is still theater. The palace's communication strategy, tweets about community projects, glossy videos of restoration work, creates the appearance of relevance without the substance. It's not deception so much as performance. The monarchy doesn't lie about what it is. It distracts you from asking why it should still exist. The risk for the institution isn't a scandal or a rebellion. It's slow realization, not outrage, but fatigue. A sense that the monarchy is a relic maintained out of habit rather than conviction. Scandals come and go, and the family always survives them. Edward V, Diana, Andrew, Harry, and Meghan. The true danger is boredom, the moment when reverence turns into indifference. Because once people stop believing that monarchy has meaning, its privileges become impossible to justify. Transparency is what the Crown fears most, because transparency dissolves mystique. If the full list of properties, costs, and exemptions were ever published, if the public could see the real numbers, the institution would lose its sacred fog. Parliament would face pressure to cap funding. Newspapers would fill with charts comparing royal expenses to hospital deficits or teacher salaries. The image of the monarchy as self-sustaining would crumble overnight. And yet, that exposure seems inevitable. Information, once unimaginable to access, now leaks constantly. Financial reporters, investigative journalists, and digital archives keep pulling at threads once considered untouchable. The question is not whether the monarchy will be scrutinized, but when the scrutiny will be too much for its old defenses to withstand. Even sympathetic observers within the system admit reform is overdue. Advisors have floated ideas: open more properties, publish detailed financial statements, reduce the number of taxpayer-funded residences. But every proposal meets the same resistance: fear of losing control. The monarchy's power lies in vagueness. To define it too precisely would reveal how small it really is. Better to remain undefined, ceremonial, a cloud of symbolism. As long as the public can't see the machinery, the crown can still be an idea rather than a liability. The paradox is that the family's survival may depend on doing exactly what it resists most: exposing itself. Genuine transparency, publishing full costs, ending tax exemptions, turning private estates into public trusts, would be painful but transformative. It would reframe the monarchy as an institution accountable to modern values rather than anchored in privilege. But such change requires surrendering control, and the Windsors have never been good at surrender. Tradition to them is both armor and prison. They inherit wealth but also secrecy, and they cannot give up one without weakening the other. It's possible the end won't be dramatic. There may never be a republic movement or a defining crisis. The monarchy could simply wither into irrelevance as public attention drifts elsewhere. Charles will age, William will ascend, the next generation will inherit estates they can no longer explain. Each reign will feel a little smaller, a little less justified, and eventually a government under pressure, economic, political, moral, will find it convenient to demand full disclosure. The data will spill out, the numbers will look obscene, and the quiet consensus that sustains the monarchy will collapse. None of this requires hostility. It only requires clarity. Once people see the royal property empire for what it is, a system of inherited advantage, insulated from the rules of ordinary life, the romance of monarchy fades. You can admire the architecture without admiring the owners. You can value history without subsidizing its descendants. The family knows this, which is why they guard their privacy so fiercely. It's not vanity. It's survival. In that sense, the royal property question isn't really about real estate at all. It's about belief. The monarchy depends on a collective act of faith that the crown still matters, that the people behind it represent something larger than themselves. But faith needs mystery, and mystery cannot coexist with transparency. The choice is between secrecy and legitimacy, and the monarchy has chosen secrecy for 1,000 years. Eventually, the illusion will break. It might not happen with protests or headlines, but with quiet recognition, the way fog lifts from a field. People will look at the palaces, the castles, the endless lawns, and see them not as symbols of continuity, but as monuments to inequality. They'll realize the crown's wealth isn't heritage preserved, it's privilege prolonged. And when that realization reaches critical mass, the question will shift from, do we need the monarchy, to what have we been protecting all this time? That's the final irony. The royal family hides its wealth to preserve the institution, but the secrecy itself may destroy it. The moment Britain sees the monarchy clearly, without the filters of nostalgia or reverence, is the moment it stops making sense. And when that happens, the fall won't be violent or sudden. It will be quiet, like a door closing on a room that no longer needs to be entered. The castles will remain, the estates will still draw tourists, and the family might even keep some ceremonial role. But the spell will be broken. What once felt timeless will start to feel obsolete, and no amount of pageantry will hide the truth that was there all along. The crown was never about duty or destiny. It was about property, power, and the extraordinary lengths taken to keep both invisible.